that we must keep the two separate. The last thing the ISI wants to do is to become, just one more political. Or we've got enough politics. And I say that I've lived in Washington my whole life. Politics, okay, but we don't have to be the end all and be all. That's why ISI is so important.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka and Tom Saruf. Today is a special episode for Conservative Conversations because this marks our 100th release of this podcast. Just about every week for the last 2 years, we've sat down with a scholar to discuss an important issue that animates conservative discourse and explores part of the conservative intellectual tradition. And so to mark this 100th milestone for Conservative Conversations, we are joined by ISI's own biographer, Dr. Lee Edwards. Lee is a professor at the Catholic University of America and founder and chairman emeritus of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and a renowned historian on conservatism, the author of over 25 books on the subject. His works include A Brief History of the Cold War, The Power of Ideas, his autobiography, Just Right, A Life in Pursuit of Liberty, and A History of ISI, Educating for Liberty, the first half century of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Lee, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Johnny. Happy to be here with my favorite collegiate organization, ISI. Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Lee. And before we get to our interview, we'd like to thank the listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to help join us in fulfilling that mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself.
Well, Lee, we want to begin by talking about the historical and political circumstances surrounding the creation of ISI, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that you, I believe, were actually a senior in college the year ISI was founded, or at least a senior in college when you first got on ISI's mailing list. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you first heard of ISI and how you got involved over the years, that could be a good segue to what was going on in campus and in the wider culture back in the early 1950s.
Well, Johnny, I thank you very much. I'm so pleased to be here with you. I was at Duke University as an undergraduate, and I believe it was in my senior year, may have been as a rising senior. I received in the mail some interesting literature. And as I recall, it was all having to do with a free market, with a voluntary society, with the importance of the individual. And that sparked my interest, but I did not recall that I had asked to be sent this information. Where did it come from? How did it come from? And it turned out that my mother was a reader of Human Events, which had published an article by Frank Chodorov saying what we need on campuses is a network of campus chapters who will distribute information, will have speakers, and will generally get those individualists sort of working together and not feeling isolated, as so many did at the time. So that was dear old mom came through for me, helped to save me from a Keynesian death, and I had reached out then to the headquarters, and it was run at that point, president, by Frank Chodorov, a very staunch libertarian who always regarded the state as the enemy. And he explained that I had been put on there along with about, I think he said there were something like 600 people, young conservatives, although he didn't call us conservatives, he called us individualists, 600 students out of a total college population of 2.5 million. So there was much work to be done by ISI in trying to provide a counter to what was going on the campuses back in those days.
I wonder about the term individualist, because I think a lot, maybe not a majority of our students, but a number of our students would view the word individualist as a bit of a dirty word. But I wonder what Chodorov meant by it, and how that fit into the early conservative movement.
Well, it's an interesting story, because if you go back and you read God and Man at Yale by Bill Buckley, which was published in 1951, as I recall, he never uses the word conservative. As a matter of fact, he says, I am an individualist and not a conservative. For him, an individualist would have been what we call today a libertarian. And I think that's one way of looking at it. But for Frank Chodorov, he thought of himself as, he always raised up the individual as the most important thing, although he conceded there was a place for community. For him, the individual was the most important thing. So in 61, young students like Bill Buckley, and I'm thinking back on it, probably myself, because I was influenced, as so many of us were, by Bill Buckley, did not call ourselves conservatives. And yet, in a very short order, and certainly by 1955, when Bill Buckley founded National Review, he referred to himself as a conservative, and he referred to National Review as a conservative journal. What had happened? To my mind, what had happened was the publication and the appearance in 1953, in between those two dates, of The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk. The influence of, the impact of Russell's book, The Conservative Mind, was that great. And in my opinion, I think that probably many historians would agree with that. So that individualist also doesn't sort of come tripping off your tongue, or a conservative with those hard letters there, that it makes sense. You can say conservative, and it seems to have more of an impact than individualist. But for the first, until I think it was about a decade later, ISI was the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. That's how it began. One more point, historical point you might be interested in, and Chodorov talked about this in For Our Children's Children, the essay in Human Events. He said that what I'm really trying to do is to counter what had been started at the beginning of the 20th century by young socialists who call themselves the Society for Socialist. So that Frank thought that it was important to have the same kind of organization countering the socialists. You just couldn't do it individual by individual. So to that extent, Frank realized that you couldn't just raise up an individual and let him do all the work. You needed to have some organization. And I can tell you a little more of the story about how that came about, if you'd like now, or as we go along in our conversation.
Sure. Why don't you feel free to add a little bit more color to that story? I think it's a great place to begin our bigger discussion.
Well, Frank Chodorov wrote this article, which was then published in Human Events. What was Human Events? Human Events in 1951, 52, and those early years was really the only sort of conservative publication around. It was a weekly newsletter, and it usually had news items in the first part of it, and then in the latter part would be an essay on a great variety of subjects. And some of the most important writers and thinkers of the day wrote for Human Events. And so that's where For Our Children's Children first appeared. Tremendous response by readers, people saying, this is a terrific idea. Please do something about it. Except maybe began earlier than college years. That's too late in the process. And so that was it. And nothing else happened, because Frank Chodorov was a writer, an editor, not an organizer, not an entrepreneur. So there is where it sort of lay simmering for about a year. And then Frank decided to revisit the subject again. And he wrote another essay, updating it, saying again, calling for a network of campus clubs of individualists. And it appeared in Human Events. And the reaction was not quite as strong this time, at least in terms of volume, but it included a check for $1,000 from J. Howard Pugh, one of the great benefactors of the conservative movement in those days. And Frank, there was this check for $1,000 in 1952 would be, I'm guessing, what, about 10 times that in today's dollars. So that was a significant size check. But Frank didn't know what to do with it. So he put it in his desk and put it in his drawer and shut the drawer. And there it stayed for a couple of days, maybe a little bit longer than that. Then Frank said, well, maybe I really ought to do something with this. And he mentioned it to Frank Hannigan, who was his boss at Human Events. And Frank, who was something of an entrepreneur, having built up Human Events into a successful enterprise, said, well, I have one rule that I never break: never send back money. And so Frank Chodorov said, oh, okay, I won't send it back. And he had an appointment. He went up and visited Mr. Pugh in Philadelphia, who encouraged him to do something about it. And as a result of that, ISI was incorporated in the spring of 1952. There were the directors were Frank Chodorov, Frank Hannigan, and Patricia Lutz. Now, Johnny, do you know who Patricia Lutz is?
I actually do not know Patricia Lutz, so please illumine me.
Patricia Lutz was Frank Hannigan's secretary.
That's fantastic.
And he needed to have, three, in DC law, you needed 3 directors.
Okay.
So that's, Patricia came in, and so she always made a joke about, I'm the founding mother of ISI.
There we go.
Right. And so that was the beginning of ISI, with the $1,000 check, with a philosophy which was libertarian and not traditional conservative. It wasn't until a couple of years later when Vic Milioni came on board and began working with ISI that its mission was broadened. But at this time, for example, it made an arrangement with FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, to send its materials every month to ISI members. So they were getting material from Hayek and from Henry Hazlitt and Leonard Reed, who was the head of FEE. And those were the materials which they were getting in those initial years of ISI.
Lee, I checked the inflation calculator, and thanks to the recent spending spree of the federal government over the last 3 years, $1,000 in 1953 would be $11,400 today. So,
wow,
quite a lot of inflation in the last 70 years. I want to pick up on a point that you just mentioned, which is, the individualist beginnings, and then Vic Milioni coming on board, and sort of the incorporation of a traditionalist sensibility, or maybe a broader appreciation of the humanities and Western civ, in addition to the libertarian economics. I'm wondering if you could, I think today, as we think about these fights within different camps of the conservative movement, we think, oh my gosh, they're using very strong language. These viewpoints seem irreconcilable. How are all these people in the same tent? But actually, if you go back and if you think of that transformation that you just described, Chodorov, I guess largely the agreement would have been around opposition to the New Deal and to, the nascent, the Cold War, and in opposition to that, really bring people together. But I do think in another sense, it is a fairly dramatic transformation when you have an individualist philosophy and then Kirk writes the conservative mind, and it's, you know, one of the most, I don't know, just beautiful, humane, it's just filled with kind of this traditionalist sensibility. And it's so, even though there's a coherence to it, it's so mysterious and large, and the figures are sprawling and eccentric, and it's an eclectic mix. And so it's kind of funny. You would never maybe necessarily think when Kirk writes that book, of course, I wasn't there to see the reception in the media, but that a decade later, it would be conservatism that sticks and not individualism, when individualism was much more defined as a philosophy than Kirk's traditionalism. So I'm wondering, and even if you look at some of the letters from Kirk, which you cite in your history of ISI, you see he uses, you know, they invite him to join the board of ISI, and he uses, you know, vehement language. You know, I think he said that the first issue of the Freeman shocked his conscience, and, you know, he felt like if they had picked, that they need to focus on capturing the imagination instead of, you know, this individualism, which he thought was reductive, and he hopes that he's considered to be a person, not an individual. So, you know, can you explain what on earth was going on that all these people came together and that modern American conservatism was born out of things that on the surface appear even contradictory?
Well, you know, Johnny, I think listening to what you're saying, and this suddenly struck me. You think back to someone like Russell Kirk. Now you would say, okay, he was a traditional conservative. How did he feel about libertarians? Now, it is true that he referred to them as chirping sectaries. You know, it's true that, and he and Frank Meyer, the great libertarian on the masthead of National Review, did not get along philosophically. But at the same time, you look at the first chapter of The Conservative Mind, and you look at the 6 canons that Russell talks about, you'll see that one of them is that there is a natural coming together and cooperation between the market, the free market, free economy, and traditional values. So what is that an example of? To my mind, that's an example of fusionism. And if you look at the very next to last chapter of The Conservative Mind, there again, Russell talks about the businessman. He talks about the small entrepreneur. He talks about the importance of economics. So what does this make him? Does it not make him a fusionist? And it seems to me that what we have today is that people are forgetting about the success of Bill Buckley and forging National Review and the whole network that came out of that, and B, Ronald Reagan, the most successful political president of the last half century, who was able to reach out and bring people in. So to my mind, Bill Buckley was a fusionist. Ronald Reagan was a master fusionist. And Russell Kirk, I think, had some fusionist tendencies, as evidenced in The Conservative Mind, and maybe even more so if you look at The Roots of American Order, where he talks about the importance of the Greek philosophers, and then the idea of the Roman Senate, then the idea of the Parliament coming out of London, and of course the Declaration and the Constitution in Philadelphia. It seems to me that there again, you have a fusionist sensibility, which is affecting his writing in The Roots of American Order. So I wish that our friends with the National Conservatives and all the others would understand and maybe borrow a little bit from Bill Buckley and Ronald Reagan, and include rather than exclude people, and try a little taste of fusionism. It wouldn't hurt.
On a related note, to hone in deeper on that, Lee, I wonder, what is the relationship, both in the early days, but throughout ISI's history, between itself as an institution, educating for liberty, being on the college campus, pushing back against the teachings of collectivism, socialism, postmodernism,
Right.
and the conservative political movement and the apparatus that started by Buckley, National Review, all of the journals and
Right.
think tanks, Heritage Foundation, obviously ultimately culminates in Ronald Reagan's election. What's the relationship between ISI and the rest of the political apparatus?
Well, I think it's a really an important point, and it's one that I talk about in my class. I just started a new class at Catholic University this spring called the Conservative Revolution, and we deal precisely with what you're talking about here, Tom. And the idea is that the importance of keeping the two apart and separate, that the movement, the conservative movement, is that it is an intellectual / political movement, and it judges its success on how many people are using its ideas, are publishing, are broadcasting, are telecasting, who are making films, who are writing poems, and so forth. That's the movement. Over here, you have the Republican Party, which is a political party which is dedicated to what? To winning elections and doing whatever is necessary to keep winning elections. And sometimes they get so far apart from why do they want to win an election. So you cannot have the success of the conservative movement judged by how the Republican Party, which is our chosen political vessel at this point, is doing or not doing. And I think that's so important that we don't, this was a point, by the way, that Vic Milioni made over and over and over again. It's one of the reasons, even in a very physical sense, where he located ISI in Philadelphia, midway between New York City and Washington, D.C. That was not only because he grew up in Philadelphia, but he did not want to be in Washington, D.C., because he didn't want to think that politics was all. Vic said over and over again that education is the secret. Frank Chodorov's initial essay was subtitled A 50-Year Program. He knew it would take decades to turn around the Keynesian philosophy and the secular humanism of liberals like Lionel Trilling and others. So it seems to me that is an essential point, that we must keep the two separate. The last thing that ISI wants to do is to become, just one more political, or we've got enough politics. And I say that as lived in Washington my whole life. Politics, okay, but we don't have to be the end all and be all. That's why ISI is so important.
Leah, getting back to those early days and the positioning of ISI, over the years, ISI has been, described as an alternate university, a parallel university. Today, I use the language of a counter university, which maybe in a sense is a little bit more adversarial, but not to be, we don't aim to be needlessly provocative. It's just that we're trying to fill the void in the higher education system, and the system has gotten far worse even than it was back in the 1950s. But I'm wondering, from a strategy question and even maybe a practical question, as we look forward to where the conservative movement is going, is it the case that conservatives, fusionists, individualists are always going to be creating institutions in reaction to the left, right? So the left has the Intercollegiate Society of Socialists. We create a response to that. The left has, you can kind of go down the line. Conservatives are always thinking about how do we, create a mirror image of what the left has done so effectively to control the power in all these sectors. And so I'm wondering, is it possible first, and what would it look like for conservatism to not to be merely a reactionary movement, but actually to become the dominant movement, or to win and have America embody a conservative ethos?
Right.
Is it possible, and what would that look like?
Well, I think it's possible, but I think it would take, it might not take 50 years, because the means of communication today are so much more powerful and move so much more quickly with the internet and social media and so forth. So I think you could do certain things within a couple of years, whereas it might take a couple of decades. I'm thinking, for example, of the University of Austin down in Texas. I had the opportunity to have breakfast with the new president there, and he was describing for us what he's doing. And he is answering a real need, and that is he has raised for his university, which is yet to have its first class, $150 million. Now, that's a significant amount of money, 150 million. And I think it shows that he is answering a really need. And I think there can be and should be, and I predict there will be other similar colleges or universities, particularly if it's as successful as I think the University of Austin is going to be. He's a great books guy. He was the head of the university, the college down in Annapolis. The great books were there, St. John's. So I think that we can look to him to come up with a conservative university. It's not going to be like my poor alma mater, Duke, trying to be another Brown university. You know, one Brown is too many. We don't need another one. I think that if you look at people really realize that the impact that Hillsdale is having, another reason to emulate its success, not to emulate a successful liberal college, but a successful conservative college. When I think of the fact that imprimis circulation is now 6.2 million, 6.2 million, my goodness. And that its impact also on setting up these various high school academies. I believe something like 40 or 50 of them right now. So I guess my point, Johnny, is that a lot is going on right now. And maybe what needs to happen, as we did back in the early days when we were putting together a movement, is that certain leaders should be in contact with each other, sharing their successes, sharing their problems, sharing their solutions. And I think moving along this counter revolution, to use your words, that you all are doing there with ISI. I think that's all possible today. And a lot of it is possible because of this thing that where you and I are communicating with today, and that is the internet.
I'd be interested to hear more about, throughout the history of ISI, what's the ISI student like? And what are they thinking? What were some of the important books that ISI would have been equipping them with throughout our history? What were they doing on campus? Things like that, things of that sort.
Right. You know, looking back at those early intellectuals and academics and professors, somebody who was very important, and he doesn't get quite as much attention as he should. That's Richard Weaver. Richard Weaver was not only somebody who was sort of there at the University of Chicago as he was a professor of English, but made a point to attend ISI functions, to be a leading speaker at the summer schools and the one-day conferences which they had. I think that the average ISI student at that point was coming into contact for the first time with Hayek, for example, The Road to Serfdom. Russell Kirk was a part of the story. Richard Weaver was a part of the story. Whittaker Chambers, the great anti-communist, providing the glue which kept the libertarians and the traditionalists together, was a part of it. So all of these books, all of these contributors were coming along at almost the same time in the 50s and into perhaps 60s. Oh, Robert Nisbet, The Quest for Community, should not forget him. And so a critical mass was being achieved. And then on top of it, to build on that, on these ideas, was National Review and Bill Buckley making a movement. This was I titled my biography of him. He truly was making a movement, not just starting a new magazine. So I think that, of course, as you all know, probably, I'm always talking about the applicability of fusionism, that to me just makes sense to include rather than exclude, to multiply rather than to divide, to add rather than subtract. And if you need some ideological glue to keep people together, well, look at what China is threatening to do. You want a foreign issue, or look at what's happening here at home, and whether it's Bernie Sanders or Mr. Biden, there's enough going on here to scare anybody halfway to death. And that seems to me it's another reason for conservatives / libertarians to come together and to work together.
Lee, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about Bill Buckley. You spoke about him as an organizer. Today, I think we live with a lot of the institutions that he created, and we embody them and are a part of them. But often when a young person thinks of Buckley, I think they think of Buckley primarily as an intellectual, or they think of firing line. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about, the man, what was this force of nature that was Bill Buckley? How did that take shape practically in organizing? Also, another thing conservatives always say is the left is the one that's good at organizing. We struggle with it, maybe politically. Yeah. So, and then to what extent was the organizing that Buckley did in any way, to what extent did it intersect with ISI as an institution, generating these crops of new leaders and populating institutions that Buckley was helping to start or bring together?
Well, certainly, if you look at Bill Buckley and what he did, I call and describe National Review as a political act. It was not just a magazine, but really was a bit of political action. And he referred to it as a formative journal. And he based it upon the influence of the Nation and the New Republic earlier in the 20th century, and the impact which it had in creating the climate in which it was possible for FDR and the New Deal to come along and to change the social fabric of America. Then, in a couple of years later, in 1960, he was sort of there as the looming presence at the formation of Young Americans for Freedom in 1960, which then provided the ground troops, both for Barry Goldwater and then for Ronald Reagan when he ran. And I happened to have been there when we started National Review. But intellectually, we needed ISI, and I don't know. I never did it, and it would be can't do it now. But if I were to, there were about 90 of us at that meeting across the country. Everybody average age of 20, 21, 22, something, 22, perhaps 21. If I had asked how many of you were members of ISI, raise your hand, I'll bet you that most of them, if not all of them, would have said, oh yeah, we get ISI materials. Yeah, we've got a campus there. Now that's the intellectual side, and you need that intellectual foundation of the philosophers like Hayek and Kirk on which to base your political action. because if you don't, then the action is just for power is all, and then you get into planning leading to dictatorship and a whole different thing than what we have here in our republic. I think that I said, I don't know that I ever asked Bill directly. I wrote a book about him directly. Did you consciously do all of these things? But if you look at their impact, and I'll mention one more, maybe as important as almost as any other, is when he ran for mayor of New York City in 1965, running against a Democrat liberal and a Republican liberal. He ran as a Conservative Party candidate, got 13.5% of the vote, far more than anybody thought that he would. But what was important was not just that political success, but it was his platform, which was made up of some fascinating ideas and suggestions, including he suggested, in effect, free enterprise zones, the idea of providing tax credits and loans to people starting up businesses in the inner cities, which is to say African Americans and Latinos. That's an idea which Jack Kemp and others picked up and used and implemented years later. But it first appeared in this country in Bill Buckley's run for mayor in 1965. Another one of his things, which is one of my favorites to mention, he said, why should it be that you have to have a medallion costing $500,000 to run a taxi? Why can't you just, if you can pass the driver's test, and if you're not a felon, and if you don't carry a gun, why can't you just go into business for yourself and provide rides for people that way? You don't have to be part of this gigantic system. Well, what do we have today with Uber and Lyft? Is precisely that same idea, going outside the usual way. Finally, I would just say, with regard to Bill, if you look at the intellectual influences on him, they represent this idea of fusionism. First, Albert J. Nock, the master libertarian, then Wilmore Kendall, a much more traditional and believing Christian conservative, Whittaker Chambers, the great defector from communism back in the 1950s, and finally James Burnham, an ex-Trotskyite and professor of philosophy, who was a senior editor of National Review. Now, all of these men were intellectuals. Yes, several of them were Rhodes Scholars, but also they had an appreciation for the importance of politics. But there has to be a balance. It seems to me that today we've got too many political organizations having their politics without any foundation, and maybe too many people on the other side being too careful not to get involved in some political matters as well. I keep coming back again, John. I know I sound like a broken record here, to the idea of fusionism.
Well, we have time for one more question, and
Lordy, have I talked that much?
it's been really fantastic, and I commend the book to all of our listeners, Educating for Liberty. But to return to something you were saying a couple minutes ago, that if you were to go into a room and ask all of these people if they were members or affiliated with ISI in some way, one of the things I took away from the book was that throughout the entire conservative apparatus, from education and at the academy to the political branches, all roads in some sense lead back to ISI, all the way back to 1953 with Frank Chodorov, and throughout the last 70 years. So, but sometimes it seems a little bit difficult to see what impact conservatism has been having, especially on the campuses, because one of the interesting things is that as ISI has had its impact on campus and created this pretty robust conservative coalition atmosphere within the academy, the mainstream academy has just gone more and more and more off the deep end in ways that I think were maybe predictable, but not necessarily foreseen. So I'm wondering if you could, I guess, talk a little bit about ISI's legacy through the 50 years in which you wrote the book, and then also the story doesn't end when the book was published 20 years ago. So what's the rest of the history, and where are we headed now?
Well, I think that, and I know you all do, but to me, I think that maybe the single most important thing you have is the Weaver Fellows. It seems to me that when you are enabling promising young PhDs to continue their studies, to graduate, to get their degree, and then to start teaching somewhere, even if it's not at Harvard or one of the most important so-called Ivy League schools. The impact of that, you think how many hundreds of students are going to be affected by that professor on that particular topic. So to me, the Weaver Fellows are the single most important thing that you do. I think that the opportunities to do the best, in other words, I would look at some of the outstanding essays by Weaver, by Hayek, who, by the way, spoke at several ISI meetings in the early days. Frank Meyer. I know there's the reprint of What is Conservatism, which came out just recently. But I would think maybe you all might take a look at doing a What is Conservatism, but with all new authors, not just those same authors, and bring in a Matthew Continetti. I'm very, very high on Matthew. I think he's brilliant. Or he happens to be my son-in-law, but he's a brilliant intellectual of the first rank, and Matthew Spalding, and others as well, and have them contribute to this idea of what is conservatism in the 21st century. Hey, there's a title for you, Johnny. What is conservatism in the 21st century?
That's a great idea.
So get some of these younger people to write chapters for you, challenge them to update some of the ideas. But I think what I would say is you've got to start with one idea. The one idea to me that makes sense, and this is talked about by Kirk and by Burke and others, and by T.S. Eliot, and that's ordered liberty. Ordered liberty, that idea of the right balance between order and liberty. And that's the constant challenge that we have. And I think the best way to reach that ordered liberty is through fusionism.
And Lee, on that note, actually, there's a great line from Churchill in his essay on consistency in politics. And he's talking about Edmund Burke in particular, and he's trying to reconcile the Burke of liberty and the Burke of authority. And he says, he was seen as, adopting a liberal view, kind of it being in favor of American independence, but a reactionary view vis-a-vis the French Revolution. And what Churchill concluded was, no, these are not two contradictory Burkes. These are, in light of the circumstances, he's advocating for liberty in one case, authority in the other, but they're all working towards the same end, which is really some conception of ordered liberty. Right. So I think on that note, concluding with ordered liberty is the perfect stopping point for our conversation.
And Johnny, what you've done is you've just given yourself your theme for your introduction to what is conservatism in the 21st century. Looking forward to that.
There we go. Thanks, Lee. I appreciate it. And thank you again for joining this podcast. I'm wondering, Lee, if people want to read more of your work, where can they find you, or where can they purchase your books?
Well, what I would suggest is, because I'm so almost consumed with the idea of our Victims of Communism project, if they would just go to my name, Lee Edwards, at victimsofcommunism.org. That to me would be the most important thing they could do.
Excellent. Well, we'll conclude with that. Thanks for coming on the show. And thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to visit us at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.